Well, ironically, and by the way, this is the finest new history of the New Deal ever done, The Forgotten Man by Amity Schley's, one of my former colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. If you want to read one book on the parallels between what happened in the 1930s and today, I urge you to read this book. And as a published author, it pains me to recommend someone else's work, but this is that good. Roosevelt actually stole the concept of the forgotten man from a philosopher named William Graham Sumner, who referred to something completely different. He said the forgotten man was the person who was going to be taxed for the goals and the purposes of far-off bureaucrats in Washington, and he would be forgotten once his money had been transferred to Washington. This is what William Graham Sumner wrote about the forgotten man. Quote, as soon as person A observes something which seems to him to be wrong, from which person X is suffering, person A talks it over with person B, and person A and person B then propose to get a law passed to remedy the evil and help person X. The law always proposes to determine what A, B, and C shall do for X. But what about C? Who is C? C is the person whose wages, resources, and income were propositioned and drawn into the service of helping X. C is the forgotten man, the man who paid, the man who never is thought of once he pays. That's the original meaning of the forgotten man. Well, we're back to that, because the forgotten man and the forgotten woman today are you, the people in this room. All of you are paying $8,700 by one calculation, $20,000 by another calculation. All of you are paying for this grand experiment. Now, if it works, if it staves off another economic cataclysm, if it brings back prosperity, it might be worth it. But let me give you some quotes which will put this into perspective. Quote, we have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work, unquote. Some people would say that's John Boehner of Ohio, the Republican leader in the House. Or perhaps Roy Blunt, the former Republican whip from Missouri. Sounds like what a Republican might say. But then there's this other quote, and all of these are from the same person. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. Sounds like a liberal Democrat. Maybe it's Charlie Rangel, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Maybe it's Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York. Then there's this other quote, again from the same person. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot, unquote. That must be Nancy Pelosi or Harry Reid denouncing President Bush's economic policies. Wrong, wrong, wrong again. All of those quotes, I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, an enormous debt to boot. We keep spending and spending and spending, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. All of those quotes are from May 9th, 1939. The setting was the House Ways and Means Committee in Washington, 6 years after Franklin Roosevelt took office as president and started the New Deal. Who was the speaker who made that testimony? His Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, who was not just a Treasury Secretary for a few months. He was Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary for 11 years, until his death in 1945. He made this startling confession in public and shocked the country. The only thing that saved his job is we were heading into World War II, and Roosevelt's economic policy was about to shift to a war economy, which changed the terms of debate, and unemployment finally then started to fall. Unemployment, which was at 25% when Roosevelt took office in 1933, if you don't count the Civilian Conservation Corps and you don't count the government relief workers who were getting 3 hots in a cot to simply keep them alive, unemployment did not fall below 18% for 7 years. For 7 years. Now, I know Franklin Roosevelt has gone down in history as one of our greatest presidents, and there is much that was great about him. He was one of our best wartime leaders. But it is a myth that the New Deal worked. It did provide hope. He did uplift people's spirits. He was a brilliant speaker. But the actual policies flopped. And his own Treasury Secretary admitted that. I fear that we're in a situation that's eerily similar. We have a very charismatic, a very persuasive, and a very charming president. And he has given many people hope. And he will continue to do so. And he has good intentions, as Roosevelt did. But he also let himself be dragged into a series of policies that ultimately simply empowered bureaucrats in Washington and impoverished the private economy, which creates jobs, which many of you create. It was a tragedy. I hope that we have discussed this history a little bit more than we did during the stimulus bill. I hope we have a longer conversation. I hope we have a better debate. Because the future of your children and grandchildren are at stake. Are we going to settle into a slow declining mediocrity, or are we going to retain our greatness? I think that's an open question. America will always be a good country. America will always be a prosperous country. But will America be number one? Will America have the cutting edge, the entrepreneurial zeal that we've been grown up to expect that it will have? I question that, and I question whether that's in the balance today. To leave you with one cheerful note, though, things are a lot different than they were in the New Deal in the 1930s. Roosevelt could dominate the public debate. He grabbed the radio microphone. No one could compete with him. In fact, we had a fairness doctrine back then, which limited debate, which is one of the reasons now that Bill Clinton and others are demanding the fairness doctrine be brought back. I suspect you'll be hearing something from that from Rush. He's already termed it the hush-rush law. We can have a much more vibrant debate than we did in the 1930s. But there are people out there that don't want you to have this debate. They want to rush through the bills in the dead of night with no one reading them. They want to talk about billions becoming trillions without breaking it down into how much it costs each of you individually, each of your families individually. They don't want this discussion. They just want you to shut up and follow. Well, that's not in the spirit of America. The spirit of America is, yes, we give every new president a chance. And I believe Barack Obama has many good intentions and many good ideas that have not been reflected so far in his administration. And I think he has learned a painful lesson by handing over the stimulus bill to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. So we wish Barack Obama well. But when it comes to his policies, the lessons of the 1930s are, if they didn't work then, we should question if the same darn thing is going to work now. It didn't work then. The same remedies are not going to work now. And that it is the patriotic duty of every American to have their voice raised and to question whether or not this is the course of action that will keep our children and our grandchildren free and prosperous. Now, ultimately, we're going to get through this. Remember what Winston Churchill once said. Government, he said, government will always do the right thing. But first it must exhaust all other possibilities and solutions. I think the genius of America is we're smart enough that we don't wait always till we exhaust all their possibilities and solutions. The American people can rise up and tell government, no, we're not going to wait for you to do the right thing until you've exhausted every possibility. The time to do the right thing is now. And regardless of what the stimulus bill cost, in a year or so, we're going to take some reckoning. We're going to see what the promises made were delivered. And if they weren't, I hope each and every one of you becomes part of that debate. I certainly will be part of it, because we're going to get a lot more of these bills coming down the pike. And your voice must be heard. And if your voice is heard, especially if it's heard when bills like this don't deliver as promised, you can change and you can influence government policy. Because ultimately, you are the sovereign in this nation. You are the power. And just as there's an election in 20 months, there's a public debate that's ongoing. And believe me, they do listen. You just have to make sure that you're armed with the facts. Thank you very much.